Since we're getting into assignments with a bit more creative wiggle room, the editing tutorials from here on out won't be the same sort of paint-by-numbers guide that went along with the digital name tag. By walking you through the process of editing my sample video, I'll be showing you the tools needed to complete this assignment. How, when, and to what extent you use those tools is up to you. We'll be touching on some simple audio work in a later section, but the real star of this show is the Effect Controls panel and keyframes. Regardless of the workspace you've got loaded up, the Effect Controls panel should be found within the larger source panel. If you're having trouble finding it, remember that you can call up any panel by going up to the menu bar, clicking Window, and selecting the panel from the list. If you want to move panels around or adjust their size, refer back to the previous editing guide. You learned last time that clips placed in the timeline can be previewed in the Program panel. The Effect Controls panel allows you to make additional adjustments to those clips. When you select a clip in the timeline, you can go to the Effect Controls panel and see a list of properties attached to that clip, along with their associated values and a mini timeline representing that clip specifically. I haven't done anything yet to this clip, so its position value is set for the center of the frame, its scale is set to 100, and its rotation is set to 0. The playhead on the mini timeline is still linked to the playhead in the main timeline, so you can adjust the playhead and make changes in the mini timeline and see those changes reflected at the corresponding points within the main timeline. Now this is important to remember. The mini timeline is based on the clip, so changes made within the mini timeline will move with the clip rather than being fixed to specific points in the main timeline. To the left of each property's name is a stopwatch icon. Clicking it will drop a little diamond on the mini timeline in line with the property and the playhead's current position. That diamond represents a keyframe. Keyframes mark the beginning and ending of a change in a selected property. I can move the playhead elsewhere within the timeline and enter a new value, which will create another keyframe when I hit Enter. I could also use the button between the arrows next to the timeline and add a new keyframe that way. In doing so, I've created a simple animation. Premiere's automatically done the math to work out how to progress from one value to the next in a linear fashion. The timing of keyframes can be adjusted by clicking and dragging them around in the mini timeline. In fact, I can swap their relative positions and reverse the animation I just made. To move multiple keyframes at once, you can select them while holding Ctrl or Shift and then dragging them. To change the value assigned to a keyframe, use the arrows next to the timeline to move the playhead between the keyframes set for that property. You want to move it until it's directly over the keyframe you want to change. If you don't, you could accidentally add a new keyframe on an adjacent frame. Click on your keyframe to select it, enter the new value, and hit Enter. When setting a new value, you can either click the value and type a new one in, you can use the up and down arrow keys, or just click it and drag left to right. Right in the middle of the panel, just before the mini timeline, you'll see a counterclockwise arrow icon, which you might think is an undo button, but it actually places a new keyframe with the value or values for that property reset. It doesn't actually affect the other keyframes. To delete a keyframe, simply select it and hit Delete. If you want to delete all the keyframes from a specific property, hit the stopwatch again to deactivate it. Wherever the playhead is when you deactivate and delete those keyframes will determine the current value of that property. So if you paused halfway through an animation that went from 50% scale to 100%, the keyframes would be deleted and the scale would be set at about 75%. If you wanted to reset it to normal, you can just hit that reset parameter button. A video clip will have 3 effect categories by default: motion, opacity, and time remapping. Starting with the motion controls, position controls the position of a clip within the frame based on the clip's anchor point. A clip's default anchor point is its centermost point, so for a 1920 by 1080 clip, the default should be 960 for the X coordinate and 540 for the Y. Clicking the name of most any of these properties in the Effect Controls panel will make the anchor point visible. Because the anchor point represents a halfway point for both dimensions, reducing either to 0 will only move it off-screen halfway. Scale controls the size of a clip relative to its original dimensions. Notice that the clip extends outward from and pulls in toward the anchor point. Rotation controls the angle a clip sits at within the frame, with its anchor point serving as the pivot point. Rotating a clip more than 360 degrees in either direction will add an integer to indicate the number of full rotations. For example, if one keyframe's rotation value was set to 0 and the next was set to 2x0, the clip would do 2 full rotations in the time between those 2 frames. The anchor point controls, naturally, control the position of a clip's anchor point. It'll maintain its relative position in the frame as you adjust it, but the clip around it will move to match those new values. You can also adjust the anchor point's position by clicking and dragging it within the Program Panel preview. The last property under motion is called Anti-Flicker, which controls a filter designed to compensate for the flickering light effect that can occur when shooting under fluorescent lights. It usually only comes up when shooting at higher frame rates, so you're not likely to need it. Moving on to the next section, oddly enough, opacity is not the first item in this category. Instead, we've got a couple of differently shaped icons. These are masking tools, which allow you to draw shapes and define what portions of a clip are visible and in what portions certain effects are applied. We'll return to these when we get to the green screen component of the last assignment, but as long as you're learning these different effect controls, it might be worth experimenting a bit. Opacity controls a clip's overall visibility, represented as a percentage. Blend modes control how the colors of a given clip interact with those of the layers beneath it. You won't be expected to work with blend modes in this lab, but there are plenty of guides online if you want to know more. And don't be worried if you can only find ones referring to Photoshop. They're both Adobe software, and as far as I know, they work exactly the same way. Lastly, time remapping controls the rate or speed at which a clip plays. This is good if you want to ramp the playback speed up and down during a single clip, but I've got a method to achieve a similar effect later, and personally I find time remapping to be a little bit complicated. Before moving on to editing proper, one last note about keyframes. By default, animations created using keyframes proceed in a linear fashion. The rate of change is constant all the way through. If you want your animations to feel a bit more natural, you can right-click on your keyframes and set them to ease in or ease out. Typically, I'll set the beginning of an animation to ease out to start slow and pick up speed, and I'll set the end keyframe to ease in to do the opposite. A clip can have multiple keyframed properties at the same time, so you can combine animations as well. There's a lot that can be done with keyframes, so I recommend you play around with them a bit.